When Bonner told me that John Tarleton was our speaker, it was a name that I recognized, but I didn't know why I recognized the name. I looked at their bio and I thought, they're a person who's been doing journalism, independent journalism for years and years. Maybe I met them as a journalist. So I Googled his name, and then I Googled my name with his name, and I found an article written in 2000. And I want to tell you a little bit of a story on the article because it's a very important moment in my life, and I think it's an important moment in history, actually. In 2000, I had just graduated from Columbia Law School. I wasn't a member of the bar yet, but I decided to spend some of my time volunteering for the National Lawyers Guild, who helps support protesters. I went down to Philadelphia during the Republican National Convention, where there was a lot of protesters outside of the convention. And I put on my legal observer hat and I attended that protest. The police at that protest, on the day that the protests were about police brutality, took the protests very seriously, and they decided to brutalize the protesters, including anyone around there, press, legal observers. They took me, knocked me down, dragged me into an alley and beat me, injuring me. And as a result, I had gaping wounds on my legs, I had bruises all over me, and I was arrested, and the police, in order to cover up their crimes, charged me with felony aggravated assault on a police officer. It's a crime that can send you to jail for 20 years. I and 41 other people were in this position of charged with felony assaults or some other felony crime. And there was another 380 people, 420 people in total that were arrested that day. Those 380 people had very, very minor charges comparatively, but the 42 people charged with felonies were looking at potentially years in jail for what happened. Meanwhile, there was a media environment that had been drummed up over several weeks prior to that convention that predicted that anarchists from around the country and around the world were going to come to Philadelphia to attack police officers and spray them with acid and try to break their bones. And so the general public was arrayed against these protesters. And the city decided to throw everything they had against these felony cases. They decided to go to trial, no negotiating. They were going to they really wanted to get some convictions out of that group. Now, we were really screwed. Most of us hadn't done anything, but people listened to police officers. And the media landscape was very tilted against us. The media just reported on all the violence that had happened towards police officers during these protests, and not what else was going on, including the suppression of rights of the protesters. This was sort of a major growing and turning moment in my life, and I decided to work on defending these cases. And we came up with a strategy. First, we needed to change the minds of the people in Philadelphia, so that when we went to jury trials in a year from that point, the story would be different. Now, how do you change the minds of a city of 5 million people so that the jurors would be on your side in that point? We needed to create a media environment that was on our behalf. We called the New York Times, we called the Philadelphia Inquirer, we told them what happened, and they completely ignored us. No TV channels wanted to have anything to do with us. So our plan was this. We will start by talking to the left media. We will get some articles validating what happened, and some people will read that. And then more legitimate media that's slightly to the left, like the city paper in Philly, would read those articles, and then they would interview us. And then once those papers started getting a story going, the Village Voice, the sort of slightly alternative stuff was covering us, then we would go into the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Post, and more national media. And over that sort of kind of island hopping strategy, we would change the minds of Philadelphia. The very first article that covered our point was an interview by John Tarleton of me. The article explained exactly what happened. It was the first time I had ever been interviewed. He told our story. That story was then picked up by others, including Gwen Schaefer from the local city paper. I forget what it was called. It was sort of like a free weekly. And she started uncovering more of the misdeeds of the police after John's article came out. And it just kind of grew from there. and we had an amazing media landscape, and none of those people ended up doing 1 day of jail time because of those prosecutions. And it wasn't just a protest that just happened and then people didn't go to jail. It was a protest that made a difference, because one of the lawyers in those cases who was at my trial was a guy named Larry Krasner. He was a defense lawyer. And he's now the district attorney of Philadelphia. I wrote a special T-shirt in his honor. And it was the victories that came from those cases that led to that political victory that has really transformed Philadelphia. Just so grateful for what you did, John. So a little bit about John. This is not supposed to be about me. John was co-founder and editor of the Indypendent, which is a free monthly newspaper that's been published in New York City since 2000. He's also the co-host of the Indypendent News Hour on WBAI. He's won numerous community and labor journalism awards over the past 3 decades. He covered the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico. He covered the Battle of Seattle, Occupy Wall Street. He covered the rise in New York City of AOC and Mamdani way before they were as famous as they are today. He's trained and led hundreds of citizens journalists through the Indypendent. And before he came to New York, he was a migrant farm worker, and he also hitchhiked 75,000 miles in 17 countries. So he's just got some amazing stories to tell us. Thank you, John. Come on.
Thank you, Bill, for that not only warm introduction, but incredible story. I had no idea this story had reverberated in that way. It's incredible to hear. Also, just so you know, some of our red and white news boxes around the city where you can pick up the paper, we acquired those from a wholesaler in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Those boxes belonged to the Philadelphia Daily News before they went out of business. So they're out of business. We're still going. We're using their boxes. So the struggle always continues. So again, thank you for that introduction. And it's so good to reconnect. And thank you to Avandra for the invitation to speak at today's service. We met last fall, and I really appreciate you following up. And of course, it's great to be here with everyone at the Brooklyn Ethical Culture Society and with everyone out there who's also online. So, as we know, for almost 150 years, the ethical culture movement has championed the idea that we have to live by a strong code of ethics to be able to live a meaningful life and to be able to change the world for the better. For anybody who wants to live a good life, ethics are the compass that point us in the direction we need to go. If our ethical compass is askew, all our efforts will falter. Now, in this current moment of state-sponsored moral collapse in the United States, when our leaders routinely lie, cheat, steal, and scapegoat the most vulnerable people among us, all for political advantage, and when millions of ordinary people feel emboldened to act out the worst version of themselves, and when many others have decided to duck and keep their heads down, living an ethical life is more important than ever. It's also becoming more dangerous as this government increasingly targets those who oppose it. And we got a preview of that in Philadelphia, and that authoritarian streak in our society has only gotten stronger. And I'll have more thoughts to share later in this talk on our present Trumpian moment and how we might move through it and even get to a better place on the other side of it. There is an other side. I also look forward to sharing some of my experiences at the Indypendent, the newspaper that was just getting started when I interviewed Bill. It's a volunteer-based left-wing newspaper that I've been fortunate to be involved with for a quarter century here in New York. But first, since you gave me a generous amount of time to talk, I want to say a few words about myself and how I came to think the way I do and act the way I do. I grew up in a middle-class family in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. As a kid, I was really into sports, especially baseball. I also liked to read lots of books, and was encouraged by my parents to follow current events and also take an interest in history and have a sense of who and what preceded us. And in our household, the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite was nightly fare. For the older generation, you might remember the 3 television networks and the nightly news. I also grew up in a Catholic family. There was CCD class, Sunday morning mass, First Communion, confirmation, all of that. My political views moved to the left in college, and I was especially affected by people I met in the peace and Central America solidarity movements of the late 1980s. By my junior year, I was done with formal religion. I didn't believe in God or religious dogma or empty rituals. The Catholic Church's misogyny also turned me off. Just a pro tip for building a healthy organization for the Catholic Church or anyone else: empower and uplift women. Don't hold them down. It's better for everyone. Despite my break with the Catholic Church, I did take away several valuable insights from my religious upbringing. First, the importance of believing in something bigger than yourself and seeing yourself as a part of that. As the old saying goes, if I'm only for me, who am I? Second is the importance of faith, not the blind faith of organized religion, but faith in oneself, faith in other people and their essential decency, and faith that we can handle whatever life brings our way, and to be at peace with that. And thirdly, a spirit of universalism. The Catholic Church attempts to speak for everyone, so it does have a universalist orientation. And in that spirit of universalism, it tells us that everybody's life matters. Everyone's voice matters. No one should be left behind in a world of great abundance that, unfortunately, is hoarded by a few. So in a nutshell, what this is all about, to my mind, is solidarity. When we are in solidarity with others, we grow and expand and become more fully human, more connected, less alienated. And so, I think that these are a lot of the sentiments of the ethical culture movement as well. So I think we're all kind of find our way to these insights. After college, I worked as a daily newspaper reporter. I had studied journalism in college, but I quit my job within a year. I was restless, and I wanted to see the world and experience all it had to offer, not just life at a small town daily newspaper. And as a journalist, I also wondered, how could I really write about people's lives with any real depth if I hardly knew anything about life myself? So I didn't know exactly where I was headed or to what end, but I knew I needed to get moving. Over the next decade, as Bill would say, I lived a nomadic life, hitchhiking 75,000 miles in 17 countries. I had a backpack full of books and journals and a couple of changes of clothes. I wrote hours every day, journals, letters, postcards, a half a novel one winter. I self-published a blog called cybertraveler.org with various stories I was writing along the way. And I supported myself by working in migrant fruit harvests in the late summer and fall. So it was a time of personal growth. I wasn't really doing activism, but I was just trying to grow as a person. We did have some wildcat strikes in some of the harvests, so that was also a powerful experience where there's nothing like winning, and when you win a strike, that's pretty awesome. And so I spent most of my winters in Latin America. I volunteered at an orphanage in the Guatemalan jungle. I was a street juggler in post-war El Salvador. I was an English teacher in a working-class barrio in Mexico City, a human rights observer during ceasefire negotiations in a conflictive zone in the jungles of southern Mexico, where communities were divided between government collaborators and the civilian supporters of the leftist rebel movement, the Zapatistas. And in case you're wondering what full authoritarian rule can feel like, the pro-government families in those communities were awarded free solar panels, so they could have electricity at night, and they flew white flags over their huts so the Mexican military would know who to target and who to leave alone if they decided to invade the village. Needless to say, this caused a lot of anxiety for the people who were not on the side of the government. The majority of my hitchhiking took place in the United States with its continent-spanning network of interstate highways. I would juggle on the side of the road, have my jester's hat on if I was in the mood, and sometimes it took a while to get a ride, other times it came quick. It always made me happy if I just made people smile, and eventually someone would pull over. And, again, this sort of, religious upbringing, each time that happened, I felt like there was an act of faith taking part between both myself and the driver who picked me up. Our system tells us to fear and distrust everyone, especially strangers. And we were quietly breaking through that. Now, I will also note I'm 6'2", white guy. I was in great shape, so I could have a confidence that most people were not. If they were looking for trouble, I was probably not the one they were going to want to mess with. But nonetheless, I had that privilege, and I used it to push the envelope of what was possible. So as I traveled this way, I listened to people's stories, and I would later write them down at night when I'd go to some roadside diner to have a bite to eat. And these people came from all walks of life, all political persuasions, and sometimes the car I was riding in would become like a confession booth that allowed drivers to share their thoughts with a stranger. Some memories I have in particular of people, a heavyset woman who knocked down a dozen beers on a hot summer day while crying over the boyfriend who had just left her. An illiterate truck driver who resented the power his wife wielded over him. A former college football player who missed the roar of a crowd when he made a big play. A one-armed Ku Klux Klansman who gave me a ride across Alabama while blaming black people for all his troubles, even though he had lost his left arm in an industrial accident, as I learned, in a factory run by the largest corporation in the state. Classic case of the white working class aiming its wrath in exactly the wrong direction. So I think about that a lot these days. Also, the cost of war. I can recall a tense, taut Vietnam vet who retold me the story of a long ago firefight where he had to stack his dead buddies' bodies around him, so many sandbags to block incoming bullets. Another Vietnam vet I rode with across the Arizona desert, whose tone changed dramatically as he sucked down a bottle of cheap wine and blurted out that he only had 11 months left to live. He had been exposed to Agent Orange during the war, and now his doctor had given him a terminal cancer diagnosis. If you want to know the real cost of war, I learned, talk to the people who had to fight it 25 years later. Something our leaders maybe should think about doing more often. On other occasions, I would have wide-ranging conversations about all kinds of things, and sometimes they would drift into political themes. And people were often curious, to have these conversations, and questions would come up. One, for example, was, why are Latin American countries you travel in so poor? The inference was that the people in those countries must be lazy or irresponsible. So how would I explain 500 years of Western imperialism and the decades of U.S.-led coups and dirty wars and economic domination in a way that was understandable and compelling to someone who rarely, if ever, had heard leftist analysis? It's not easy, but I tried and learned something along the way. So by the time I interviewed Bill for that article about the Philly R2K legal defense effort, I was making a big transition. After a decade on the road, I had become tired of always moving on, of always saying goodbye. I wanted to be in one place for a while, and I did accomplish that. And that place would be ultimately be New York City. After my experiences both participating in the human blockades at the Battle of Seattle that shut down the WTO, and then later writing about it extensively, I felt a strong pull toward covering the upsurge in activism that followed the Seattle WTO protests that gave us the Philly R2K protests and many other mass protests there for a couple of years before 9/11. And I did so through a radical media network called Indie Media. Now, at an independent media conference held in Vermont in the fall of 2000, I first learned about the Independent, was just getting started at that time, and the woman who was at the center of all, Anna Noguera, invited me to join in. I brought with me my journalistic training and background, as well as everything I had learned since I had left corporate media behind. So, and one of the central I guess things that's almost obsessed me is this question of how the left, how progressives can communicate their ideas in a clear, common sense manner, not just in abstract jargon. We have a lot of the best ideas and analysis and great intentions, but we often stumble in being able to talk to people who don't already share all of our assumptions. And this was something I learned through my hitchhiking conversations, and I really tried to bring that, I guess, concern into my work at the Independent, and as best as I could, try to help create a newspaper that was understandable and accessible, not only to activists, who are definitely a core part of our audience, but we wanted to have a broader mass appeal, to be interesting and relevant to people who were not already fully bought in as full-time activists. So, that's something that we, really worked on. And one, I guess, basic insight I had was, before you can get people to go with you on your more abstract ideas, you have to establish a sense of shared values. Like, people have to believe you share their values before they're going to buy into your abstract arguments or all the facts you might be able to muster on your behalf. And I think one of the most basic levels is on a sense of fairness. I think most people have a fundamental sense of fairness. I think that's, and sort of what's right and wrong. And I think the corporate media spends a lot of time pitting us against each other, peddling a bunch of nonsense and confusing the public. But at a base, that's what I learned when I was hitchhiking. And a lot of the people who picked me up, the one common denominator they had was like, well, brother, I was out on the side of the road one time myself. I couldn't leave you behind. I mean, that was, on that kind of basic level. And just like, I think as people in Philadelphia learned about the injustices that were done to the protesters as y'all began to break into that space, the sympathy moved toward you. While people, revere the cops more than they deserve, I think a lot of people can also understand that, that cops abuse people, and so it's all about doing the work to break through and not not obsessing about, okay, who's the most ideologically correct person in the room, like that kind of almost inner left competition for the correct line, I think blinds us to what we really need to be doing, which is talking to a mass audience. So that's part of what we've been trying to do at the Independent. And a big transformative moment for us, about a year after we started publishing, was 9/11. You had a situation here where the people that drove those planes into the buildings murdered roughly 3,000 New Yorkers, and the city was in shock and dismay. And at the same time, our government was trying to gin up support for some very destructive wars, and we saw that. We knew this was coming, and we published a special edition within 48 hours. It was only 4 pages, but but it was, okay, how do we talk about this? And on our front page story, one of our reporters, Mike Burke, who's now been a longtime stalwart at Democracy Now! For many years, he talked to peace activists from War Resisters League and some other groups, and the fundamental question he was essentially that was raised is, if we start a war of revenge and it's eye for an eye, where will this all end up? Well, that turned out to be a pretty important question to ask on day one, because we're still doing it. And we also had articles about the looming attack on civil liberties, on immigrant, especially Muslim communities. I interviewed Bill McChesney, the great media critic and analyst, and he mapped out exactly what the corporate media was going to do. We also had first-person stories from survivors, people who had managed to escape the buildings. I think we had a story about pets that were missing their owners and what was going to happen to them, and also where you could go donate blood. This was when we still thought there was going to be more survivors than there were going to be. So it's like how to be, political, but also be human. So, and we took those papers to Union Square, where there was huge gatherings in that first week or two after the after 9/11, and the people were just grabbing them like crazy. And we had so many more people started coming to our weekly meetings who wanted to join in the paper. We had one guy who had been a reporter for the New York Times in the 1940s at the United Nations. He came out of retirement to become our UN correspondent. And it's if you're relevant to people's lives, people pay attention. And if you have something to offer, people are going to want to get involved. And we really grew after 9/11. My responsibilities grew. I went from being a prolific reporter on the paper, an editor. I started running a monthly Saturday afternoon workshops to train all these sort of novice aspiring journalists, like basic training, and then help them go out and do their first stories. And that's how one of the ways we built up a staff. And we also had to build our citywide distribution network. There was just a lot of work to be done, but there was tremendous enthusiasm as well. Somebody donated a 2,000 square foot loft space on East 29th Street that we were able to use. Several of us lived there, myself included, as I like to say. The rent was cheap and the commute to work was short. So, and I think as we were building the Independent, the left doesn't have a lot of institutions, and often they can be frail, prone to collapse, and it's so important to nurture these institutions, also to nurture a space like this, the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, that's bringing us all together here in this physical space and also online. So we really, that we were learning as we were going, and I also think, for all the journalistic work we've done, we've also, just by having that space, we've literally, I stopped counting somewhere past like 500 or 600, but we've had hundreds and hundreds of volunteers come through over the years, some for a short amount of time and other for years or even decades. But all the relationships that were built, friendships, romantic relationships, all of it, and I would occasionally look on Facebook and see, oh, this friend of mine is like friends with somebody that I hadn't seen at the Independent in 10, that came through 10 years ago, but now they're friends, and it just, that also means a lot. And that's what is another reason it's important to nurture our progressive spaces. It's not just the work we do, it's the relationships and connections we make along the way. But of course, progressive media like the Independent, also serves other roles. It can amplify movement voices, like we were able to do in Philadelphia, more than I ever imagined. Train new journalists. We've helped seed Indy-trained young journalists who've gone on to other media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Democracy Now!, as well as more left-wing and community journalist outlets. And I'd like to think some of those people who went to those high-profile outlets carried at least some nub of the spirit that we imbued at the Independent. The very first journalist I trained at the Indy, Heather Haddon, she later went to the Wall Street Journal, but she broke one of the stories that helped take down Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, in Bridgegate. And that happened like 13 years later. She and I stayed in touch, but it was kind of like, wow. I remember when she was a 22-year-old kid just coming through the Indy, and now she's got Chris Christie on the run. So that's a good feeling too. And I put out some copies of our 25th anniversary issue that we celebrated last fall on the table over there. I know some of you picked it up. In the center spread, there's sort of a highlight reel of some of our best stories over the years. You may take a look at it later on, but I mean, we were there full tilt covering the Iraq War, anti-war movement that Tom and many others were a part of. The RNC, when it came to New York, 4 years later, we saw a lot of the same police state abuses, and we're ready for it. After Philly, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the rise of electoral leftists like AOC and Zohran Mamdani. We had Zohran on our cover a month after he announced his campaign, and our headline was "Mr. Mayor?" and and the subhead was like, he's got a army of socialist supporters who are dreaming big with him. Well, they dreamed big, and then they went out and did it. And the first place many people saw anything about this campaign was on the front page of the Indypendent. And that's because we're like, if you listen and follow what people are doing at the grassroots, you have insights that the corporate media ends up following you much later. I remember a friend of mine years ago said, like, if I want to really know what's going to be important in 6 months, I just read the Indypendent. So, hold on a sec here. And so, yeah, and one, yes, and then we've done, like I said, we've also done a lot of local stories that maybe don't have the magnitude of the great movements, of our era, but are just people fighting battles for their communities, in defense of public schools, against, demanding justice for victims of police violence, all of that. One of my favorite stories, I still have a clip of from many years ago, was called "Direct Action Ducks Blockade Bulldozer Bullies." It was a story about people defending a community garden out in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and they were trying to get the court to put in an injunction, and I guess it was probably, I think, Bloomberg's people wanted to tear the garden down before the injunction came in, and they sent the bulldozer. And around on a Friday, on midday, the bulldozer driver was about to follow orders, and this little parade of like a mother duck and her ducklings kind of walked in the way of the bulldozer, and the guy decided, I'll go take a lunch break. And by the time he comes back from the lunch break, the court order has come down. And I found this out. I mean, the activists at the garden told me this story, but I needed to get confirmation. So I managed to track down the bulldozer driver and talk to him that night. And he kind of explained what had happened. I was like, okay, this is for real. And we had a photographer on the scene. And anyway, so we had this story with like a photo of these little ducklings walking around the garden. And anyway, it's great to be in touch with what's happening at the grassroots, whether it's smaller stories like that or the great stories of our time. And I think that in doing that, you build a trust and a confidence. We've also covered a lot of immigration stories, ICE stories over the years. The story of Robbie Rogbir, the immigrant rights activist. We started covering that in 2010. We put him on the cover in 2017. Renee Feltz wrote that cover story. Thank you, Renee. That really helped galvanize support for Robbie at a time when the Trump administration was hot to deport him. He ultimately got a pardon from Biden days before Biden went out of office. So many times we've been on top of the ICE story. And then in February, we had as everything was happening in Minneapolis, it really riveted the nation. We had a cover story from a woman named Nancy Hoke, a community activist here in Brooklyn, and it was her story narrating her experience of feeling powerless and hopeless as kind of the horrors of the Trump administration unfolded. In her experience going to one of those Know Your Rights trainings that was going on and becoming active in mutual aid work in support of immigrant communities, first in Sunset Park And then she decided to bring that to her own community and reached out through friends in her local community garden and started her own neighborhood group, which has done outstanding work over the last few months. So in telling that story on the cover of the Independent, we were essentially offering people a roadmap for how to engage and become, not just upset and angry, but meaningfully engaged. And and in that issue, I shared a few of my own comments in my editor's note. I'll quote myself here just for a moment. What we were seeing there in Minneapolis, I think, is really the central struggle that we're going to face for many years now, which is the power of solidarity versus the power of this growing fascist police state. And as I was saying, we're going to need all that courage and public spiritedness in the months and years ahead. We are in a volatile seesaw moment in which an authoritarian regime is trying to consolidate its power and crush all dissent, but has still only partially succeeded. This country, with all its flaws and contradictions, was founded 250 years ago out of a rebellion against an autocratic king by people who insisted on speaking their mind and not being pushed around. Sounds a little bit like Minneapolis. That same rebellious spirit would later help fuel abolitionist movement against slavery, the women's suffragists who insisted on the right to vote, the great factory strikes of the 1930s that birthed the modern labor movement, civil rights struggles of the 60s that gave us a more inclusive society. So now what we are seeing in opposition to Trump and his authoritarian MAGA movement, and the habits and beliefs of a people accustomed to having lived in a democratic republic, I believe, are not easily vanquished. This was an insight from Machiavelli 500 years ago when he was writing The Prince. And so 4th of July is coming up. We're going to see all the patriotic pretensions of Trump and MAGA, who are actually deeply hostile to everything and everyone that has made this country good and decent. And we also live with the forever wars of the 2010s that we protested and tried to stop. Now that war is coming home, and we see it in the rounding up of the so-called worst of the worst immigrants, which we all know is just a pretext for more repression. So how this struggle between white nationalist authoritarianism and multiracial democracy turns out, I believe, is still up for grabs. MAGA has the guns and state power. We have the people and the resolve. Think of Renee Good and Alex Preddy calmly facing down their killers in the final moments. That comes from refusing to live in a dystopia that Trump and MAGA would impose on us. When one of them falls, many more have stepped forward. Amid the darkness, we are finding something within ourselves that is giving us the fortitude to push through the current nightmare. It will also give us the clarity to create a more just and compassionate world when we get to the other side of this. And just last thoughts here. I believe the way we get to the other side is through organization, and that if you are feeling alone and powerless, maybe spending more time than you ought, doom scrolling on your phone, put your phone down and reach out to other people. This is what Nancy Hoke did, and it was transformative to her. I think the Brooklyn Society of Ethical Culture here is a great incubator for bringing people together and helping nurture a moral sensibility and community. And then there's also many other organizations in the city that are doing, various whatever you want to call it, various work. There's the mutual aid networks, like the ones that have risen up to oppose ICE. There's cultural activities. I think, Mary, you described being at the choir yesterday. That can be very powerful. A singing movement, I believe, is a winning movement. There's, if you're in a union, find your progressive people in your union, or you start a union, which is something young people have been doing more in recent years. And there's also political groups like Indivisible, Working Families Party, and we have a huge DSA chapter in this city that played a key essential role in electing our socialist mayor, Zohran Mamdani. And they also have all sorts of cultural activities going on themselves. There's going to be electoral work in the fall around midterms. So there's a lot we can do, and it's easy to feel powerless, and of course that's part of what we're trying to do in the Independent. We don't put on rose-colored glasses. We try to tell it like it is, but we also try to, in a sense, galvanize people to feel like, okay, there's a way for me to engage and not just feel hopeless. And that's what Trump and the corporate media more and more want you to do, is just feel hopeless and checked out. So I encourage you, again, find the people that are right for you, the work that's right for you, and it'll be much more empowering than just feeling sad about things. And thank you for your time. We have copies of the paper and also a newsletter you can sign up for and stay in touch with everything the Independent's doing.
Right. John, we have a little time for our Q&A.
Oh, okay.
So if folks have questions, I'll sort of kind of cultivate those questions. Yeah, come and stand around here, and then if there are questions, I'll hand the mic back to you. Raise your hand if you want to ask